A good portion of the United States is designated as mountainous terrain, and every year dozens of pilots crash in these areas. Many of these accidents could have been prevented through proper education and flight training. When preparing for a mountain flight, the first thing you should do is get a mountain checkout.
Welcome to Colorado.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. How are you? I heard there were some pretty severe storms down across the Midwest.
Yeah, I had some bad weather over in Nebraska, but nothing serious.
Good. Well, you made the right decision stopping by for a mountain checkout. Why don't you go ahead and tell the people?
I didn't want to take any chances. I've never flown in the mountains before, and I really want to be well prepared.
I wish more pilots had that attitude. Well, this afternoon we'll go over some pre-flight considerations. Then first thing tomorrow we'll do a short mountain flight. Our goal in this program is to familiarize you with certain mountain flying techniques and not to turn you into a bush pilot. We'll be flying to several paved public use airports at high elevations or in mountainous terrain. Let's begin by watching a videotape that provides good pre-flight planning techniques for mountain flying. If you have any questions, feel free to speak up and I'll stop the tape.
Pre-flight planning is necessary for every flight, but it's particularly important in the mountains where special considerations have to be made for weather, airport operations, course selection, and aircraft performance. One of the first things you may discover is that it can be difficult to get an accurate, comprehensive weather briefing for a mountain flight. There are several reasons for this. One is the fact that reporting stations are normally more scarce in the mountains. Those stations that do report often have limitations on how much of the surrounding area they can see because of ridges and other terrain which block the view. Another source of surface weather observations is AWOS. These systems only report very localized weather, and therefore extra caution must be taken to be sure you have accurate information on the areas outside of the AWOS range. Mountains also tend to influence or create their own weather. This can result in rapidly changing conditions, so great care must be taken when preparing to fly into those areas. For these reasons, it's difficult to accurately forecast local and en route weather. In order for you to get the most complete weather picture possible, use as many sources as you can think of. Additional sources include calling ahead to airports along your route to get first-hand information, or even calling the Forestry Service or local law enforcement agencies. When obtaining weather, there are a couple of areas you need to pay special attention to. The first area includes ceiling and visibility. VFR weather reports in the mountains can be very misleading because the ceilings are reported above ground level and many mountain airports are located in valleys. This means that even though the airport meets the legal definition of VFR, surrounding mountains and terrain may be obscured by relatively poor weather. So you should consider the difference between the field elevation and that of the surrounding terrain to determine if you can navigate VFR over the higher areas. The second section you should pay special attention to during the weather briefing is wind reports. As a general rule, winds at mountaintop level greater than 30 knots should be considered a limit for operating a light general aviation airplane in the mountains. One of the reasons for setting this limit is the Venturi Effect, which can occur when wind blows across a ridge combined with a boundary of undisturbed air flowing above it. This causes the wind to be greatly accelerated and, in some cases, double in velocity. The Venturi Effect is also found when flying in some mountain passes. Wind velocity through the pass may double or even triple the speed of the wind flow entering the pass. Finally, unstable air, combined with strong winds and mountainous terrain, can induce severe turbulence that may exceed the capabilities of some airplanes, making travel in a light aircraft potentially dangerous. If the air is stable, winds of 20 knots or more flowing across ridges can produce mountain waves. These waves flow downwind of the mountainous terrain and may extend for hundreds of miles. Since these waves are capable of producing severe turbulence, they should be avoided if possible. If sufficient moisture is present, there are some characteristic clouds that can warn you of the presence of a mountain wave. The altocumulus standing lenticular, or lenticular for short, forms in the crest of the waves. This type of cloud is found in the middle altitudes. It's constantly forming in the updrafts of the wave and dissipating in the downdrafts. The term standing lenticular comes from the fact that it appears as a stationary, lens-shaped cloud. Cap clouds form much the same way as the lenticulars, but they are usually found at the mountain tops and along the ridges. These clouds can obscure the mountain peaks and ridges and may indicate turbulent conditions. Rotor clouds form downwind of the ridge. The significance of a rotor cloud is its ragged and rough texture, which is indicative of severe turbulence. Pre-flight planning should also include airport considerations. Anytime you're flying into an unfamiliar airport, be sure to check all available sources for the latest and most accurate information. One source for that information is published NOTAMs. You should check all available NOTAMs before flying to or from any airport. Reviewing the airport facility directory can also help you become familiar with each airport, especially the runway layout, special procedures, and the surrounding terrain. It's a good idea to envision the terrain around an airport by using the airport facility directory in conjunction with the section. This can help you draw a mental picture of obstructions and terrain around the airport before you even arrive. Finally, you should call ahead to get the latest local information. For example, during the migratory season, you should ask about the possibility of animals on the runway. This is especially true if the airport is near heavily forested areas. In addition, if there is snow in the forecast, a phone call can alert you to snow removal operations. The hours of operation and services available can also be verified. This is important because your ability to obtain fuel or other services at a mountain airport may dictate whether or not you can complete a planned trip. Now, let's shift our attention to course selection. Most pilots navigate using some form of radio aids like VOR, GPS, or LORAN. Take a look at this segment of Victor 134 between Denver and Aspen. It has several peaks higher than 13,000 feet. Aircraft performance is a critical factor at these high elevations. And navigating along this airway would take you over some very inhospitable terrain. In the mountains, weather, performance, your capabilities, and the terrain often make following valleys, rivers, highways, or railroads a much better choice than going direct over unpopulated or rugged terrain. This also affords numerous landing sites in case of emergency, and might mean that you can make the flight without supplemental oxygen. Therefore, instead of flying the airway to Aspen, a better route might be to fly over Corona Pass to Kremlin, then follow the Colorado River to just west of Eagle. From there, you could follow the valley into Aspen along the Roaring Fork River. This route follows valleys and lower terrain and reduces the performance requirements of the airplane. It also allows for a safer route in case of an emergency by providing more suitable landing areas.
Another important consideration during the pre-flight planning is to calculate your airplane's takeoff performance to ensure that all the runways are long enough for your airplane. This is especially true at mountain airports where high-density altitude will decrease your airplane's performance. Remember, airplanes land in a shorter distance than they take off in, so it's important that you calculate your takeoff distance at all the airports that you intend to use. Now let's take a look at how airplane weight, runway condition and slope, and high-density altitude affect performance.
Your operating weight should be carefully considered when flying in the mountains. Reducing your takeoff weight below the maximum allowable gross weight can improve your aircraft's takeoff distance and climb performance. For example, the takeoff distance for this airplane, weighing 2,950 pounds, is 2,770 feet. Reducing the weight by 200 pounds reduces the distance required to clear a 50-foot obstacle by 500 feet. The condition and slope of the runway can also have an effect on your airplane's performance. However, most manufacturers don't provide data for operating on snow-covered runways, wet runways, or runways with a slope. Therefore, you need to be familiar with your airplane and use your best judgment. For example, if the wind is light, you might find it more beneficial to take off downhill with a tailwind rather than uphill into the wind. Remember, though, that many times the main criteria for determining takeoff direction at mountain airports is the terrain immediately beyond the runway. Just remember that if you're ever in doubt as to the outcome of a particular operation, you should delay the flight until more favorable conditions exist. Finally, a high-density altitude greatly affects takeoff distance. This is because as density altitude increases, the performance of an aircraft, especially a normally aspirated engine, decreases. The same holds true for propeller efficiency and aerodynamic lift. You may be familiar with density altitude at much lower airports where the temperatures can exceed 100 degrees. But a mountain airport may have a high density altitude when the temperature is as low as freezing. It's hard to imagine that density altitude could be a factor at such low temperatures, but it's a problem anytime the temperature is higher than standard for the field elevation. For example, Leadville, Colorado has a field elevation of 9,927 feet. Therefore, the standard temperature is 23 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that even with the temperature at the freezing level, the density altitude is already more than 500 feet above the field elevation. Performance also depends on the fuel and air mixture. Operating at an incorrect ratio decreases the amount of power your aircraft is capable of producing, and consequently decreases performance. To ensure you're operating at the most efficient ratio, you should always lean the mixture per the manufacturer's recommendation. Climb performance also changes with density, altitude, and weight. For mountain operations, many experienced pilots recommend a minimum climb rate after takeoff of 300 feet per minute as a go, no-go decision factor. If you can't achieve this rate, you might want to wait until the conditions improve. Remember, climb rates are dependent on holding a specific airspeed. Normally, this is Vy. But as altitude increases, the best rate of climb airspeed decreases. Be sure to use the speed appropriate to your altitude and weight, and not the sea level figure. When considering aircraft performance, many pilots believe that if they have an aircraft with a turbocharged engine, they don't have to worry about density altitude. However, this isn't the case. Turbochargers only allow the engine to produce sea-level power. In the thin air at high-density altitudes, the propeller cannot translate all of the engine power into thrust, and the wings require more true airspeed to produce the lift necessary to fly. As a result, performance still suffers.
Something you want to be aware of is that some manufacturers don't provide performance information for operations out of high altitude airports. When I operate to or from an airport where I cannot calculate the takeoff performance from the charts, I use one of two devices. This is the takeoff performance computer, and this is the cost chart. Now, you may not be familiar with these devices, but they adjust your sea level takeoff, ground roll, and climb rate performance for ambient conditions. However, if you do decide to use one of these two devices, there is one thing that you should realize: they are not made for a specific make and model of airplane. What they do is provide general estimates of airplane performance. Now, I know you fly a single-engine airplane right now, but in the event you decide to transition to a twin in the future, there are a few things that you should consider.
An engine failure in a twin on takeoff at an airport with a high-density altitude possesses some unique challenges because accelerate stop and accelerate go distances may be greatly increased. While it isn't a regulatory requirement, if a takeoff looks marginal during your pre-flight planning, you might want to wait for better conditions or offload some weight to improve single-engine performance. If you lose an engine above the single-engine absolute ceiling, you're going to descend until reaching this altitude. This is called drift down. If the terrain happens to be higher than the single-engine absolute ceiling, you're going to have to make an off-airport landing unless you've planned carefully and are in the vicinity of an airport. If the terrain is lower and remains lower than this ceiling, you should be able to fly to an airport. In either case, your ability to overcome downdrafts and control the airplane in turbulence will be complicated by the decreased performance and the adverse handling characteristics inherent with single-engine flight in a multi-engine aircraft. Besides the weather briefing, airport and performance considerations, and route planning, other areas of interest during pre-flight planning include navigation methods, time of day of the flight, and survival. Since the primary methods for navigating in the mountains will most likely be pilotage and dead reckoning, you should be proficient in this type of navigation. This is important because when comparing terrain, one peak or valley can look just like the next. In addition, you should use a sectional instead of a whack chart because it provides more detail and information. To help verify your position, be sure to use as many ground references as you can. And use radio navigation where available. If you have a choice of the time of day for your flight, the mornings are generally best. The cool morning air lowers density altitude and may lessen convective activity. However, morning flights are not without a downside. The low sun, as it rises in the east, can be distracting and make it difficult to see surrounding terrain. Keep this in mind if you're planning an eastbound flight. Perhaps you can plan your course to avoid looking directly into the sun. And unless it's absolutely necessary, you should not attempt to fly in the mountains at night. The lack of visual contact with the ground, combined with the normal nighttime illusions, make this a dangerous practice. Another consideration is survival. Since mountainous terrain is more rugged and less hospitable than other types of terrain, you must be prepared in the unlikely event that you're forced to make an off-airport landing. We've already discussed route selection for the purpose of navigation, but a good route should also provide survivable terrain. For instance, valleys mean lower elevations and subsequently higher temperatures, while roads usually mean population and a better chance of being spotted if you're forced down. One way to increase your chances of survival is to file and then activate a flight plan. With a flight plan, chances are you'll be found within 24 hours. Without one, the average time for rescue increases to 3 days. And to aid in search and rescue, be specific when you file the flight plan. If your route follows a road or river, list them as your route of flight. Then during the flight, make position reports so there is a record of your progress. If you do have to make an emergency landing, a survival kit, ELT, and handheld two-way radio will make it easier for someone to find you and to help you cope with the elements. Survival kits are available commercially, or you can make your own. The survival kit should contain supplies that will allow you to treat injuries, provide for shelter, food, and water, and enable you to signal rescuers. In addition, you should carry enough clothing to protect you from the elements in case you have to land in inhospitable terrain. An ELT is required for most flights and should be considered mandatory in the mountains. Make sure the ELT is working and that the battery has been replaced according to the regulations. A handheld two-way communications radio is good insurance. In case the aircraft radios are unusable, it allows you to communicate